Now, I want to start with sort of a why are we here? Why does the world need this analysis? And I was involved in the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, as Thomas had said, and many discussions of the Sustainable Development Goals. And people are really looking for demography, for certain answers. And I'm trying to tell you this to just motivate you more. And I think we start with some sort of theory of science thoughts. In the context of the ERC, there's a big discussion, why do the humanities and the social sciences only get about 17% of the entire funding, with 83% going to the natural sciences. And there's a conclusion that we have to do more to have attractive paradigms communicating what we're actually doing. And in these discussions, I've introduced this notion that in the humanities and social sciences, it's worthwhile to distinguish between identity sciences, that is who we are, where we come from, what is our identity. This is really the essence of the humanities, but also of some qualitative social research. And what I call the intervention sciences. This comes from early childhood intervention, and social policy is often called an intervention science. And this requires understanding the world around us, what are the mechanisms, and in particular what a certain intervention, a certain action, or even lack of intervention would likely result in. So in economics, if the central bank wants to increase the interest rate, this is intervention science. They need to study what is the likely consequence before they actually do it. And I think in demography we are also very much into intervention sciences. And as I mentioned before, this is really for the long-term future of humanity, for the particularly sustainable development goals, as you know, that were in September in New York decided by all the nations in the world. And right now you see in Paris the leaders of the world sitting together and worrying about climate change, and again here for assessing both the mitigative and the adaptive capacity of human populations to climate change. And our work is really very important. Now a word on what are we doing in adding education to age and sex, something that has been sort of the founding idea of the Wittgenstein Center, which is not only on demography but also on human capital. And this also goes along with trying to understand what actually is the education, or even more generally, the cognition effect. Gösta just talked a lot about education, specific differences, and clearly people with education behave differently. But my point is they also are differently. We have really good reasons to assume what we call functional causality, as something that at least for the foreseeable future and for the context we talk about is a true causal relationship. From better cognition and education to better health, to fertility, particularly in the context of fertility decline, the demographic transition, and that will be our topic, and all other kinds of behaviors. And there it's important to see that education is not just a proxy for socioeconomic status. That's what most demographers and sociologists do. It's sort of a sorting of the class structure of the society. But if you go into the literature on brain research, on cognitive science, which I did for the last time, you find that there is a real physiological effect. And maybe just cite Eric Kandel, you may have heard him, he's a Vienna-born medical doctor, then he migrated to New York in the 1930s, and he got in the year 2000 a Nobel Prize for his work on understanding memory. How does the brain work? And I had the opportunity of speaking a few panels with him, and he often says this, that let us repeat this point for a third time, not just once, but 2 times and then 3 times, and then you really build new synaptic structures in your brains. And when you walk out through this door, you're physiologically a different person than when you entered. So it means that education, similar to age and sex, does have a real physiological component. And everything else that we experience after this learning process will be perceived by a different brain, and we're just building up on these synaptic structures that are already there. And I say this is so important because it gives really education a real function and not just some social sorting as some sociologists look at it. We had a big chapter in our book on this topic. I just highlight a few things, what the enhancement of the cognitive skills. There's significant evidence that it changes our behavior to be less risky. It extends our personal planning horizon. and in particular we learn more quickly from past damage. Evidently, it also gives us better access to information, which is also useful, and it is often associated with higher income at the individual and at the household level. Now, much of this has been reflected in a recent book that came out last year. It's more than 1,000 pages, where we, for all countries in the world, produced not only age and sex scenarios, but also by level of highest education attainment, by 6 education attainment categories, and as you may have been one of the experts, more than 550 international experts involved in this. This was also part of my recently completed ERC Advanced grant on forecasting society's adaptive capacity to climate change. And population by education is one of these forecasting forces of adaptive capacity. Now let's come more closely to what we are looking at. So for every country in the world, here we have a high fertility country such as Kenya. We must make some assumptions about future, not just overall fertility, so the green line here is the total population. The TFR, like the UN projections assume it, or most conventional projections assume one TFR trajectory, of course declining as the process of demographic transition goes on. And then we have the currently empirically observed education differential. So in Kenya, women who've never been to school have more than 6 children on average, and those of the higher educational groups have below 3 or less. So it's a massive educational differential. And now then we just have to find a way to project them over the coming decades. And also mentioning that the green line really depends on what are the different weights given to these. So we need some theory for where it is going, and that's actually the main topic where I'm advocating more thinking, more theory about where is the overall total fertility level of the world going to. This has huge implications for the longer term future, and what are likely to be the future education differentials. So we assume somehow a sort of constant relative education fertility differentials. And then of course the green line where this depends on the weighting, whether there are more uneducated women in the population, then it will be higher, or when there are more educated, it will be pulled down. And this was also exemplified in a survey article we did recently, where we showed alternative scenarios. So given the identical education-specific fertility schedule that you just seen, we have an extreme scenario, a constant enrollment numbers, so no new schools being built, and there the world population is going to continue growing very rapidly, and you see by color here the education rate means never been to school, and that will actually be growing. So this is a stalled development with rapidly growing population and a relatively poor education on the world level. And the opposite is the fast-track scenario, like all countries in the world embarking on a successful education expansion similar to Singapore or South Korea, really very rapid. And then of course you see many more highly educated people. But the interesting thing is there that even with the identical education-specific fertility rates, only due to the different sizes of the education groups, you get more than 1 billion difference in world population size already by the middle of the century. Now, I've talked about this adaptive and mitigative capacity, and this is really underlying much of what you hear in the discussion. I'm sure, but you're following some of this discussion in Paris. It's really sort of, there's this green climate fund being proposed, $100 billion per year spent on climate change. And there's the fight going on, should this be primarily be spent on mitigation, sort of reducing our consumption, particularly in developing countries, or should it be spent on adapting to already unavoidable climate change? So we don't have time to go into this, but demography plays a key role both on the consumption, how many people of what income groups and also what education consume what resources, but then of course education matters a lot for innovation, the technology coming up with green technologies, and thus mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, not just to a change in our consumption behavior, but also to green technologies. And much less actually studied what is the differential vulnerability. And there's also this demographic differential vulnerability. People of different age, of different sex, of different education level are differently vulnerable to these risks that come along with climate change that affect our livelihood or directly our health and mortality and our migration. So there is an enormous potential feedback on human well-being and on demographic forces from climate change. It just shows that we put together quite some analysis of what are the other demographic differentials as well as education differentials, and we clearly show that this vulnerability to natural disasters depends a lot on the level of education in the household. We also put this together, and as you may know, that the international climate change adaptation community is primarily consisting of engineers. You want to build seawalls here, a new irrigation system, new dams, new highways. But we point with our studies, no, let's focus at the soft side, at the social development side, which actually is more powerful, and particularly in the context of our climate prediction models are not yet good enough to say exactly what in a specific area of Africa in 50 years will there be more rainfall in the winter or less rainfall in the winter. We don't have this detail. So under this, as well as the other conditions we describe here, it makes much more sense to empower the people through education, through then flexibly react to whatever climate challenges come. And so the Science magazine put here the subtitle, Fund More Educators rather than just engineers. But this all depends on kind of analysis that we demographers need to do. And one of the major demographic inputs was into this new generation of scenarios by the World Climate Change Community called the SSPs, the Shared Socioeconomic Pathways, where you see 5 standard scenarios with many sub-scenarios that capture both the societal challenges to mitigation, meaning changing our energy system to reduce our emissions, because we need to be empowered to, and here we are strongly empowered, and here we have much more difficulties, as well as the socioeconomic challenges for adaptation, dealing with already unavoidable climate change. And again, here we have a high social development, which is an even lower challenge, and we have huge inequality. Fragmentation of the world is a high challenge. And I just show you what these different scenarios, they have been translated into different world population scenarios by level of education. This is the medium one that we call the SSP2, it's at the middle of the road. You see the world population continue to increasing, then leveling off mostly as a function as more women getting educated, but rather slowly. Then the SSP1 is the rapid education development, rapid social development associated with lowering mortality, lower infant mortality, but also lower fertility. And then we have the stall, the SSP3. You see the world population goes up to about 12 billion people, and there's very little progress in further education. So these are alternative different futures, and there's specific numbers that we demographers have to come up with that enter these climate models that not only go to 2100, but often even go to 2200, because there's so much momentum in the climate system, really depend crucially on what we assume about the long-term fertility level by level of education. So it's really of significant relevance what we're doing here. Now let me come to the real topic of my discussion and some new thinking about putting the cognitive dimension more explicitly into the demographic transition rationale. You see, this is a typical demographic transition, with first the death rates declining from some months, some fluctuations at high level, and then with a certain lag, the death rate declining. Now, where does cognition come in? Well, the whole demographic transition started in Europe in the early 19th century, again in Scandinavia, which also were the best educated populations there. And we are doing together with some Swedish colleagues on this old Umeå historical demographic database some analysis what really triggered these early mortality declines, and was income more important, or was it medical advance, or was it the education status? And we do find already many indications that, for instance, teachers and ministers in church who didn't make much money but had a good education had much lower, they were quicker in having the mortality decline than innkeepers or merchants who had more money but less education. Okay, so this is the historical record where we still need a little more evidence. Where there is the historical fertility decline that we talked a little more, and there's also I put together a few quotes where it's very clear that the transition from a more fatalistic to a more rational attitude towards family planning and childbearing has been the major driver. And for the less developed countries today, many studies were carried out that really show that female education, together of course with availability of contraceptive methods, are the key drivers for bringing down the fertility. And let me see, there was one box that's disappeared. Yeah, it's here, the B. It's the mortality just in poor countries today. Also, we have many studies that show, particularly for infant mortality, but for other mortality declines, it's really been mother's education, this cognitive empowerment, to knowing to at least boil the water before you feed it to the child. That makes all the difference in bringing down the death rates. But now where are we in the late phases in a mature, highly educated and supposedly rational society? What is going to be the long-term future of mortality? Well, there's a big discussion that between the group that is very optimistic and the group that's very pessimistic. We don't have to go into this. But there also is an equally and even more important question, as you will see some simulations about what is the long-term level of fertility. Now, I mentioned that what the cognition and the fertility transition in the historical one, it's really still up to this day the nicest summary of the 3 preconditions for a lasting fertility decline was given by Ansley Cole in 1974, where he defined as one of the 3 preconditions that fertility must be within the calculus of conscious choice. We need to start thinking rationally about how many children we want. The other 2 preconditions had to deal with the fact that large family size is advantageous and there are acceptable means of limiting your family size. There is Philip Arias, a great social historian. He also put it into this word that the great change came when husband and wife began to plan their own lives and the birth of their offspring. They introduced foresight and organization where formerly there had been only automatic, unplanned behavior. So again, in other words, this transition to a more rational planning. And finally, Etienne Vanderwall, who was my teacher in demography at the University of Pennsylvania, he gave his PA presidential address on numeracy and fertility, and he said the numeracy and the conceptualization of family size was a necessary condition for adopting family limitation. So these are all things that go on in our brains. And in that respect, I sometimes say the brain is our most important sexual organ. Now, some years ago, together with Marianita Testa, we introduced this notion of the low fertility trap hypothesis in some conceptualization, where we sort of have a hierarchy going from the personal ideal family size to cohort fertility period, fertility number of births, and show how a different mechanism influence here. The main mechanism really that we focused on is that after for a while the society has only very low fertility, the next gen is socialized in a way that the personal ideals are a function of what they see around them, so that the reality becomes the norm. Well, in Europe we don't see too much of this yet, and there have been studies cited that the 2-child norm is still very prevalent in Europe. But if we look to East Asia, the situation is quite different. In Shanghai and Beijing, for instance, there are big surveys that show that now, after 20 or more years of strict 1-child norms, and there are only 1-child families around, 80% of the women say that they want only 1 child. 1 child is the ideal family size because they haven't seen anything else. And at this point, I should also say that the Wittgenstein Center recently was instrumental in setting up a new Asian Demographic Research Institute in Shanghai, at the University of Shanghai. Former YASA colleague Leiben Zhang is the founding director there. We just had the opening in early November, and 2 of our Vienna senior scientists, Samir Kaisi and Guy Abel, have just been appointed as professors at the University of Shanghai. So we hope to do much more collaboration with the East Asian context. Okay, now what I'm trying to do now is sort of revisit the scheme. I'm less interested now into these mechanisms of feedback that may or may not be at work. That's a matter of empirical testing. But again, see at where does education come in. And the main story is that we really have to distinguish between what is the personal ideal families, the 2 top ones depend very much on the societal context. So what is the net balance of whether education on balance leads to a lower or to a higher fertility as compared to the personal ideal? That is a matter of the social conditions. So it's a relatively complex framework, but the main part is that we really have to distinguish between the two main determinants, which is desired family size, which is exogenously determined, and then the empowerment to realize the desire and overcome the obstacles, which also includes avoiding unplanned pregnancies. That's clearly where better educated women are better in avoiding unplanned pregnancies, but then there may be this possible conflict between career and family, partnership issues, and also the biological clock here comes in. As first of all, if postponement takes place, that is disfavoring more educated women who have a smaller biological window. But on the other hand, of course, there is medically assisted reproduction that may be more open to more educated women, and so that is also possibly better ways of overcoming this. So in summary, that the empowerment of women through education generally increases, but the obstacles, some of the obstacles may also increase as a function of education. So what is the net outcome of all of these forces? Well, we just have to look at empirical data, and here where I just this morning copied something from this wonderful new European fertility data sheet that you have all in front of you. You see here for a selection of countries, for different cohorts of women, born in the late 40s and born in the late 60s, their completed fertility by level of education. And you see in every country there still is a gradient in the sense that more highly educated women have lower fertility. So these inhibiting factors seem to dominate the empowering factors. Yeah, there's also all kinds of maps, and there's also a very nice website where you can download many of the maps that are even not printed here. So here you see a European map of the difference in fertility between the highest and the lowest education groups. And you see again, not surprising, the Nordic countries have the lowest difference, and the Eastern European countries really have the highest difference. You can all look it up in the data sheet there. And this is really one of the most interesting, it's a very sophisticated graph that has a cohort perspective on the mean intended family size by level of education, and then the actually completed cohort fertility by level of education, and the resulting gap. So if you look at these top lines, these are the mean intended family size. So intention, of course, is not exactly the same as ideal, but it comes close. And here you actually see that in some countries like Switzerland, there's almost no education gradient. Or for instance, in Spain, actually, the most highly educated women have a higher mean intended family. So here you start to see some inversion. But then, when it comes to the actual realization, again, you have almost everywhere, except in Belgium, where you come close to a mild U-shape. You have, even in Norway, this small education gradient. So this is empirical data that we really need to look at in order to evaluate what is the relative power of these different factors. First of all, determining the desired family size by level of education, and then the empowerment of actually reaching your desires. And I want to conclude just again with the very big picture. I said that climate models often go to 2200 or 2300. Here Shelboff and myself had published a paper where it just simply did the long-term scenarios, assuming different level of mortality and fertility. Here I just picked the one where you have 100 years is the limit to life expectancy. And then you see that indeed if the world's fertility declines to 1.5 TFR, which is sort of today's European or today's Chinese, by the way, you're really going down here to 2 to 4 billion people. And of course, this in a way is a very positive future from an environmental perspective. Some time ago I was invited by the Royal Statistical Society to summarize some of the findings, and I gave them the rather provocative title, Towards a World of 2 to 6 billion, but now we are already 7.3 bound for further increase, well-educated and therefore healthy and wealthy people. And after my most recent ERC-related work, I would add, who will be able to successfully adapt to already unavoidable climate change. And where we're going to be somewhere here in the long-term future depends on what's going to be the long-term level of fertility, depending on female education. Thank you for your attention.